My mother didn't just stop talking to me. She held a literal funeral for me while I was still breathing. She invited the whole town, served my favorite cake, and then buried my childhood photos in a box in the backyard. For 5 years, I was a ghost in Oak Creek. My crime? I told the truth about my brother, the town's golden boy. But what my family didn't know was that I wasn't the only ghost. There were 6 others, and we were all waiting for the same door to open. Before I tell you what happened, take a second to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment below. And tell me something. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it where you are right now? I always love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The strange thing about becoming a ghost is that it doesn't happen all at once. Nobody wakes up one morning and realizes they no longer exist to the people they love. It happens slowly. A missed phone call, an ignored text, a family dinner you are no longer invited to, a holiday photo where your place at the table suddenly belongs to someone else. One day you notice your absence has become normal to everyone except you. That was how it happened to me. My name is Elena Vance, and before I became the ghost of Oak Creek, I was just a daughter trying to survive inside a family that worshipped the wrong person. Oak Creek was the kind of town people wrote magazine articles about. Tree-lined streets, historic buildings, friendly neighbors, annual harvest festivals. The kind of place where everybody smiled at each other in public and whispered about each other in private. In Oak Creek, reputation was everything. People protected it more fiercely than money, more fiercely than truth, more fiercely than family. And nobody had a stronger reputation than my older brother Caleb. If Oak Creek had a king, it was him. People loved telling his story. The local football star who never left town. The hardworking contractor who built businesses from the ground up. The generous son who paid his parents' bills. The community leader who sponsored charity events and donated money whenever someone fell on hard times. His picture hung on walls. His name appeared in newspapers. People shook his hand like they were meeting a celebrity. I remember walking through town with him once when I was 23. We couldn't make it 20 feet without someone stopping to praise him. A store owner gave him free coffee. A retired teacher hugged him. A woman at the bank called him the pride of Oak Creek. Meanwhile, I stood beside him carrying my library books like invisible luggage. Nobody asked about my day. Nobody cared what I thought. I wasn't angry about it back then. At least I don't think I was. I had simply accepted my role. Caleb was the son. The rest of us revolved around him, especially our parents. My mother Martha treated every achievement of his like a national holiday. If Caleb completed a construction project, she baked a pie. If Caleb got mentioned in the newspaper, she bought extra copies. If Caleb sneezed, she probably considered calling a doctor. My father Silas wasn't much different. He admired strength, success, influence, everything Caleb represented. At family dinners, the conversation always somehow found its way back to him. I would talk about a book I was reading. Sarah would mention a project at work. And within minutes, Dad would be saying something like, "Speaking of success, did Caleb tell you about the new contract he signed?" The spotlight always returned to him. Always. I learned early that fighting for attention was exhausting, so I stopped trying. Books became my safe place. Libraries became my sanctuary. Stories made more sense than people. At least stories usually had heroes and villains clearly labeled. Real life wasn't that simple, especially when the villain smiled for photographs. One Sunday evening changed everything. I remember it clearly because the air smelled like rain. Our entire family gathered around the long dining table in my parents' stone house on Briar Lane. The same house where every important memory of my childhood lived. The same house where my mother would eventually bury photographs of me as if I had died. Caleb arrived late. Of course he did. Important people always arrive late. The moment he walked through the door, everyone seemed brighter, louder, more excited. My mother rushed over and hugged him. My father asked about business. Sarah laughed at a joke before he'd even finished telling it. I sat quietly and watched. At one point, Dad raised his glass. He smiled proudly at Caleb. You know, he said, this family would fall apart without you. You're the glue holding everything together. Everyone nodded. Everyone agreed. Everyone except me. Not because I disagreed exactly, but because something about the statement bothered me. Maybe it was the way Caleb smiled afterward. Maybe it was the satisfaction in his eyes. Or maybe it was because deep down I had started noticing little things. Tiny cracks in the perfect image. Moments that didn't fit. Stories that changed slightly every time they were retold. People who suddenly stopped coming around. Uncomfortable silences whenever certain names were mentioned. Nothing concrete. Nothing I could explain. Just a feeling. Like standing in a beautiful house and smelling smoke somewhere inside the walls. You can't see the fire, but you know it's there. And once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. I remember catching Caleb watching me from across the table that night. Just for a second. His smile remained exactly the same. But his eyes didn't. His eyes seemed to ask a question. Do you know something? The feeling vanished as quickly as it came. I looked away. Told myself I was imagining things. Told myself I was being paranoid. After all, Caleb was the golden boy. The entire town couldn't be wrong. Could they? A few weeks later, his 30th birthday arrived. The celebration was exactly what you'd expect. Dozens of guests. Music echoing through the house. Expensive decorations. People laughing louder than necessary. My mother had spent days preparing. She wanted everything perfect. Because that's what happened whenever Caleb was involved. Everything had to be perfect. I almost didn't go. Crowds exhausted me. Family events exhausted me even more. But skipping would have created drama. So I went. And for the first hour, nothing unusual happened. People talked. People drank. People praised Caleb. The same script everyone always followed. Then I went looking for my coat. And that was when I heard the sound that changed my life forever. A quiet sob. Barely audible. Coming from behind a pantry door. I stopped walking. Every instinct told me something was wrong. I turned toward the sound. And without realizing it, I took a step closer. The next few minutes would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Everything I thought I knew about my brother. And everything I thought I knew about the town of Oak Creek. I didn't know it yet. But I was standing at the edge of a cliff. And one conversation was about to push me over it. Here is slot 2. I stood frozen in the hallway. The music from the party felt distant now. Muffled. Like it belonged to another world. For a moment I wondered if I should walk away. Maybe it wasn't my business. Maybe I had misunderstood what I heard. But then another sob came through the pantry door. A broken sound. The kind of sound that comes from someone trying desperately not to cry. I pushed the door open. Inside, standing between shelves filled with canned vegetables and paper towels, was Maya. She was 16 years old. A distant cousin who visited during family gatherings. She was normally cheerful. Talkative. The kind of girl who laughed with her whole face. But the girl standing in front of me that night looked completely different. Her shoulders were shaking. Her eyes were red. And there was pure fear written across her face. The moment she saw me, she quickly wiped her tears. Almost like she was embarrassed for being caught. Are you okay? I asked softly. She nodded immediately. Too quickly. The kind of nod people give when they are absolutely not okay. Before I could ask anything else, the pantry door opened again. Caleb stepped inside. For a brief second, his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. A flash of irritation. A flash of surprise. Then the familiar smile returned. The smile everybody loved. The smile that made people trust him. The smile that made people ignore their instincts. There you are, he said casually. His voice sounded perfectly normal. Too normal. He looked at Maya. Don't be such a drama queen. Then he laughed. It was a joke. Maya stared at the floor. Caleb reached over and patted her shoulder. To anyone else it probably looked harmless. Friendly. Brotherly. but something about it made my stomach twist. When he turned toward me, his eyes lingered for a moment. Just a moment. Long enough for me to feel uncomfortable. Long enough for me to remember that strange look across the dinner table weeks earlier. Then he smiled again. Elena. His voice was smooth, confident. Everything okay in here? I nodded automatically. My instincts were screaming at me, but I couldn't explain why. Not yet. Caleb walked away. A few seconds later, Maya followed. The party continued. Music, laughter, birthday cake, people celebrating the golden boy. But I couldn't focus on any of it. I watched Maya from across the room. She stayed close to her parents. She barely spoke. And every time Caleb entered her line of sight, she seemed to shrink. That night I couldn't sleep. Something felt wrong. Terribly wrong. The next afternoon I drove to Maya's house. I didn't call first. I just showed up. Part of me expected her parents to send me away. Part of me expected Maya to deny everything. Instead, she answered the door herself. The moment she saw me, her expression changed. Like she knew exactly why I had come. We sat on the back porch. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The autumn wind moved through the trees. Leaves drifted across the yard. Finally, I asked the question. What happened yesterday? Maya stared at her hands. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then the tears came. The words followed. Slowly at first. Then all at once. And with every sentence, my heart sank deeper. The details aren't important. What matters is that no 16-year-old should ever have to tell that story. No child should carry that kind of fear. No family should protect the person responsible. Yet even before she finished speaking, I knew exactly what would happen if I told anyone. Nobody would believe her. Nobody would want to believe her. Because the truth would threaten something bigger than justice. It would threaten Caleb's reputation. And in Oak Creek, reputation was sacred. I drove home feeling physically sick. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Maya crying in that pantry. I heard her voice. I heard her fear. By sunrise, I had made my decision. I wasn't thinking about consequences. I wasn't thinking about my family. I wasn't thinking about what it might cost me. I was only thinking about one thing. If I stayed silent, I would become part of the problem. So I went to the sheriff's office. I remember my hands shaking as I walked inside. I remember the fluorescent lights, the smell of stale coffee, the old clock ticking on the wall. Detective Miller listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't dismiss me. He simply took notes. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair. The expression on his face told me everything. This wasn't the first time he'd heard concerns about Caleb. That realization chilled me. When I left the station, I felt terrified. But I also felt relieved. For the first time since the birthday party, I believed I had done the right thing. I had no idea what was coming. The fallout started less than 24 hours later. My phone exploded with messages. Relatives, friends, neighbors, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were angry. Some were confused. Some demanded explanations. Word traveled through Oak Creek faster than wildfire. By the second day, everyone knew. By the third day, I was public enemy number one. Then my father called. I still remember staring at his name on my screen. Part of me hoped he was calling to ask questions, to understand, to hear my side. I answered immediately. Dad, how could you do this? His voice cut through mine like a knife. No greeting, no concern, no hesitation, just anger. I felt my chest tighten. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about. His voice grew louder. You've humiliated this family. Humiliated. Not hurt. Not worried. Not concerned about Maya. Humiliated. That was the word he chose. I tried to explain. I tried to tell him why I spoke up. He didn't let me finish. You've always been jealous of your brother. The accusation hit me like a slap. Jealous? I couldn't even process it. That's not true. It is true. His voice hardened. Caleb has spent his whole life helping this family, building this town. And now you're trying to destroy everything he's worked for. I sat there speechless, listening, hurting, waiting for him to ask even one question about Maya. He never did. Finally, he said something I would never forget. If you don't withdraw your statement, don't bother coming home for Christmas. The silence that followed felt endless. Then he added something even worse. Actually, don't bother coming home at all. And just like that, the conversation ended. My father hung up. The line went dead. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was completely alone. I wish I could tell you that was the worst part. It wasn't. The worst part was realizing that my father wasn't the only one choosing Caleb over the truth. He was just the first. Within days, the rest of Oak Creek would make their choice too. And when they did, my life would never be the same again. Here is slot 3. The first thing people take from you when they decide you're the villain is your voice. After that, they take everything else. Within a week, Oak Creek had reached its verdict. No investigation. No trial. No evidence. Just a collective decision. Caleb was the hero. I was the problem. Everywhere I went, I felt it. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when I walked past. People who had known me since childhood suddenly acted like strangers. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Friends stopped answering messages. Some even blocked my number entirely. The loneliness arrived quickly. But the betrayal arrived even faster. A few days after my father's phone call, my sister Sarah made a public post on social media. I remember staring at the screen in disbelief. She had uploaded a photo of herself standing beside Caleb, both of them smiling, both of them looking happy. The caption was long, painfully long. She called Caleb one of the strongest and most generous men she had ever known. She praised everything he had done for the family. Then came the part about me. Without mentioning my name directly, she described a jealous person desperate for attention. Someone willing to destroy a good man because they couldn't stand living in his shadow. The comments flooded in. People agreed. People applauded her courage. People praised her loyalty. And some people attacked me openly. I sat alone in my apartment reading every word. Each comment felt like another brick sealing me behind a wall. The worst part wasn't what strangers said. The worst part was knowing my own sister had written it. The same sister who used to sneak into my room during thunderstorms because she was afraid. The same sister who once promised we would always protect each other. Apparently, some promises don't survive family pressure. The harassment grew worse. Someone slashed my tires. Then it happened again 2 weeks later. Anonymous messages appeared online. Coward. Liar. Attention seeker. Family destroyer. I stopped reading them eventually. Not because they stopped hurting. Because they hurt too much. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. I held on to hope. Naively. Stubbornly. I believed the truth would matter. I believed facts would matter. I believed someone would listen to Maya. I was wrong. The pressure on her became unbearable. Her parents were terrified. Friends whispered. Teachers treated her differently. People questioned her story constantly. Everywhere she went, she carried the weight of an entire town's expectations. Eventually, she broke. I don't blame her. I never will. She was 16. She deserved protection. Instead, she was abandoned. Months after her original statement, Maya publicly claimed she had misunderstood the situation. She said people had overreacted. She said there had been a misunderstanding. The moment those words became public, Oak Creek celebrated. The golden boy had been vindicated. The hero had won. And I had officially become the villain. The case collapsed shortly afterward. No charges. No trial. No accountability. Just silence. I remember sitting alone in my car after hearing the news. The steering wheel blurred through my tears. For months I had endured criticism, threats, and isolation because I believed speaking up mattered. Now it felt like none of it had accomplished anything. The truth hadn't won. The truth had been buried, and everyone seemed relieved. A few days later, my mother called. For a brief moment, I thought maybe she was reaching out. Maybe she wanted reconciliation. Maybe she wanted to understand. Instead, she invited me to lunch. When I arrived, she already looked angry. Not sad. Not concerned. Angry. She barely waited for me to sit down. "Why couldn't you leave it alone?" I stared at her. Those were her first words. Not hello. Not how are you. Just accusation. I felt something inside me crack. A small piece of hope I didn't even realize I was still holding. "Mom." "No." She shook her head. "You embarrassed this family." There it was again. Embarrassment. Reputation. Image. Always image. Never truth. Never safety. Never accountability. I asked her one question. Just one. What if Maya was telling the truth? My mother looked away. For the first time, she couldn't meet my eyes. That should have told me everything. Because deep down, I think she already knew. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not consciously. But some part of her knew something wasn't right. Yet she chose denial. Because accepting reality would require dismantling the version of Caleb she had spent 30 years building. And some people would rather lose a daughter than lose an illusion. A month later, I learned just how far my family was willing to go. A former neighbor called me secretly. She sounded uncomfortable. Almost guilty. "There was something you should know." My stomach tightened. "What?" There was a long pause. Then she told me. My mother had hosted a gathering at the house. Family, friends, neighbors, people from church. Nearly everyone who mattered in Oak Creek. She called it a healing celebration. A chance to move forward after the scandal. But that wasn't what people remembered. What they remembered was something else. At the end of the gathering, my mother brought out a box. Inside were photographs of me. Childhood pictures. School pictures. Family vacations. Birthday parties. Every memory that included me. Then she carried the box into the backyard. Several guests followed. And she buried it. Someone actually asked why. My mother smiled sadly and said words that would haunt me for years. "The daughter I knew is already gone." I couldn't breathe after hearing that. I sat in silence holding the phone, trying to process what I had just learned. My own mother had held a funeral for me. Not metaphorically. Not emotionally. Literally. She erased me while I was still alive. And somehow that hurt even more than the rejection. Because funerals are supposed to happen when someone dies. My family buried me simply because I refused to lie. That night I packed a suitcase. Just one. I folded clothes mechanically. Almost numb. The apartment around me felt unfamiliar. Like I was already leaving before I had actually left. When I finished packing, I walked through my room one last time. There wasn't much to take. A few books. Some photographs. Personal keepsakes. Then my eyes landed on a small blue porcelain bird sitting on a shelf. My grandmother had given it to me years earlier. She used to tell me something whenever life became difficult. She would place the little bird in my hand and say, "People can lock doors, Elena. They can even lock windows. But they can't stop the sky from belonging to you." I picked up the bird carefully. For the first time in months, I smiled. A tiny smile. But a real one. The next morning, I left Oak Creek. No farewell party. No goodbye dinner. No tears from my family. No one standing in the driveway waving. Just me. One suitcase. One porcelain bird. And an entire life collapsing in the rearview mirror. As I drove away, I kept waiting for someone to call. My mother. My father. Sarah. Anyone. The phone remained silent. Hour after hour. Mile after mile. Silence. By sunset, I crossed into a city where nobody knew my name. Nobody knew Caleb. Nobody cared about Oak Creek. For the first time in my life, I was completely alone. And strangely enough, that was also the first moment I felt free. What I didn't know then was that the hardest part wasn't leaving. The hardest part was surviving what came after. Because exile doesn't end when you leave home. Sometimes it follows you for years. Here is slot 4. The first year after leaving Oak Creek felt like surviving a shipwreck. Every morning I woke up disoriented. Every night I went to sleep exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. There is a special kind of grief that comes from losing people who are still alive. You can't mourn them properly because they're still out there somewhere, living their lives, celebrating holidays, taking family photos, laughing at dinner tables. They simply choose to do it all without you. That grief followed me everywhere. I rented a tiny studio apartment on the edge of the city. The kitchen was barely larger than a closet. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors arguing. The radiator made strange noises at night, and the entire place permanently smelled like lemon cleaner. For a long time I hated it. Then slowly I began to love it, because every inch of that apartment belonged to me. No comparisons, no expectations, no golden boy, just peace. I worked constantly. During the day I worked at a public library. At night I took classes. Weekends disappeared into assignments and part-time jobs. I wasn't building a career. I was rebuilding myself, brick by brick, day by day. The loneliness was brutal. Birthdays were the worst. I would stare at my phone wondering if maybe this year would be different. Maybe someone would reach out. Maybe someone would remember. Maybe someone would care. But every year passed the same way. Silence. Christmas wasn't much better. While families gathered around fireplaces and dinner tables, I sat alone with takeout food and old movies. Sometimes I cried. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I simply stared out the window and wondered how people who claimed to love you could erase you so completely. During those years, my family never contacted me. Not once. No birthday messages. No holiday greetings. No apologies. Nothing. 5 years of silence. 5 years of being treated like a memory everyone preferred to forget. Yet life has a strange way of growing in damaged soil. Slowly, things began to change. I finished my master's degree. The day I graduated, I sat in my car afterward and cried. Not because of the diploma, because there was nobody to call. No parents waiting proudly. No family celebration. No congratulations. And yet somehow I had done it anyway. I had survived. That realization mattered more than the degree itself. A year later I met Leo. First I almost ignored him. He kept showing up at the coffee shop near the library. Always carrying a book. Always ordering the same drink. Eventually he started conversations. Small ones. Safe ones. The weather. Books. Dogs. Life. Leo wasn't loud. He wasn't charming in the way Caleb had been. He didn't dominate every room he entered. He listened. Really listened. And after years of feeling invisible, that felt extraordinary. One evening we were walking through a park when he asked a question nobody had ever asked me before. What happened to make you believe you have to earn love? I stopped walking. The question hit harder than I expected. Because I didn't have an answer. Or maybe I had too many answers. Leo never tried to fix me. Never pressured me. Never demanded explanations. He simply stayed. Sometimes that is the most powerful form of love. A few years later we adopted a rescue dog named Jasper. Then we bought a small house with a garden. Nothing fancy. Nothing impressive. But it was ours. The first time I planted flowers in that garden, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Not dramatic hope. Not movie scene hope. Just a quiet realization that maybe my life wasn't ruined after all. Maybe Oak Creek hadn't taken everything. Maybe there was still something beautiful ahead. For the first time in years, I stopped looking backward. I focused on the future. I focused on healing. My therapist, Dr. Eris, helped more than anyone. I still remember one particular session. I was talking about my family. Again. Talking about guilt. Again. Talking about whether I should have stayed silent. Again. Dr. Eris listened patiently. Then he said something that changed my life. Elena, you didn't destroy your family. I looked at him. He continued. You simply stopped protecting the illusion that was holding it together. The room became very quiet, because deep down I knew he was right. Families built on denial eventually collapse. I wasn't responsible for the collapse. I was simply the first person willing to acknowledge the cracks. That realization lifted a weight I had been carrying for years. Little by little I healed. Not completely. Some wounds never disappear entirely, but they stop controlling you. I reached a point where I could think about Oak Creek without crying. I could hear Caleb's name without feeling physically sick. I could look at old photographs without immediately putting them away. Life felt stable, predictable, safe. I believed the story was over. I believed Caleb had won. I believed the truth had lost. Most importantly, I believed none of it mattered anymore. Then came a Tuesday in October. The day everything changed. I remember exactly where I was. The library had just closed. Rain tapped gently against the windows. I was organizing returned books when my phone vibrated. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but something made me answer. Hello. There was a pause. Then a familiar voice. A voice I hadn't heard in 5 years. Elena. My stomach tightened instantly. Detective Miller? Yes. His voice sounded older, heavier, like someone carrying news that weighed 1,000 pounds. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled slowly. I told you I would call if anything ever changed. My heart began beating faster. Not racing. Not yet. Just faster. The way it does before a storm. What happened? Another pause. Longer this time. Then he said words I will never forget. It changed. I gripped the edge of the desk. Every nerve in my body suddenly felt awake. What changed? Detective Miller lowered his voice. 6 women walked into my office this month. The room seemed to tilt. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He continued. They all told similar stories. I closed my eyes. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then came the sentence that shattered 5 years of silence. And every one of them mentioned your name. I felt tears forming instantly. Not sadness. Not yet. Something else. Validation. Relief. Shock. All of it at once. The detective continued speaking. But for a moment I couldn't hear him. Because after 5 years of being called a liar, a troublemaker, a jealous sister, and a family destroyer, the truth had finally started moving. And this time it wasn't moving alone. The ghosts were coming back. And they were no longer afraid to speak. Here is slot 5. For several seconds I couldn't speak. I stood alone in the quiet library, gripping my phone so tightly my hand hurt. 5 years. 5 entire years. 5 years of silence. 5 years of being treated like a liar. 5 years of wondering whether speaking up had changed anything at all. And now Detective Miller was telling me that 6 women had walked into his office. 6. Not 1. Not 2. 6. The number itself felt overwhelming. Because every new voice confirmed what I had known all along. The truth had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting. Waiting for someone brave enough to speak first. Waiting for someone willing to stand alone long enough for others to find their courage. Elena. Detective Miller's voice pulled me back. Are you still there? Yes. My voice cracked. I'm here. He explained everything carefully. The women came from different backgrounds, different ages, different parts of the county. Some had remained silent for years. Some had tried to tell people and were ignored. Others had convinced themselves nobody would believe them. But eventually they all heard the same story. The story of a woman who lost everything because she refused to stay quiet. The story of me. One by one, they decided they were tired of being afraid. And suddenly the foundation Caleb had built his life upon began to crack. The district attorney reopened the case. New evidence surfaced. Witnesses came forward. Records were reviewed. Questions were asked that nobody had dared ask before. For the first time, Caleb wasn't controlling the narrative. For the first time, people stopped seeing the golden boy. They started seeing the man behind the mask. A few weeks later, Detective Miller asked if I would testify. I didn't answer immediately. The request terrified me. I had spent 5 years rebuilding my life. I had finally found peace. Returning to Oak Creek meant reopening wounds that had barely healed. It meant facing my family, facing old memories, facing people who had treated me like an enemy. That night I sat on the back porch with Leo. The autumn air was cool. Jasper rested beside us. And for a long time neither of us spoke. Finally Leo asked the question, "What do you want to do?" I stared into the darkness. Then I answered honestly, "I want to stay here and never think about Oak Creek again." Leo nodded. "That's understandable." I looked down at my hands. "But if I don't go, I'll regret it." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "Then you already know your answer." A month later, I drove back to Oak Creek. The town looked exactly the same. Same streets, same stores, same houses. Yet somehow everything felt different. Maybe because I was different. The frightened woman who left 5 years ago no longer existed. I had survived too much to be intimidated now. The courthouse stood at the center of town. Cold, gray, unforgiving. As I walked toward the entrance, I felt dozens of eyes following me. Some curious, some ashamed, some still judgmental. But none of that mattered anymore. Inside the courtroom, I finally saw my family. The sight hit harder than I expected. My mother looked older. Far older than 5 years should have allowed. My father sat stiffly in his chair. The confidence he once carried was gone. Sarah looked exhausted, like someone carrying a burden too heavy to hide. Then my eyes found Caleb. For years I had imagined this moment. I thought I would feel anger, hatred, vindication. Instead, I felt almost nothing, because the person sitting at that table wasn't the giant who had haunted my life. He was simply a man whose choices had finally caught up with him. When I took the witness stand, my heart pounded, but my voice remained steady. I told the truth, the same truth I had told 5 years earlier. The pantry, Maya, the pressure, the threats, the exile, the funeral my mother held while I was still alive. Everything. The defense attorney tried to discredit me. He suggested I was bitter, jealous, resentful. The same accusations I had heard for years. Finally, he leaned forward and asked a question. "Isn't it true that you've always been the difficult child in your family?" The courtroom became silent. I looked directly at him. Then I answered, "No." My voice echoed through the room. I wasn't difficult. I paused. I was simply the only person willing to say that someone's reputation is never more important than another person's safety. The silence that followed felt powerful. For the first time in years, nobody interrupted me. Nobody dismissed me. Nobody looked away. They listened. The trial continued. Day after day. Witness after witness. Truth after truth. Then came the moment nobody expected. The moment that changed everything. The prosecution called a surprise witness. Sarah. My sister slowly walked toward the stand. The same sister who had publicly called me a liar. The same sister who had defended Caleb for years. She looked terrified. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Then she started crying. Real tears. The kind that come from carrying pain for far too long. When she finally found her voice, the entire courtroom froze. She admitted everything. The denial. The fear. The guilt. The reason she had attacked me years ago. Because accepting my truth meant confronting her own. As she spoke, I watched Caleb. For the first time, his confidence vanished. The mask slipped. And underneath it was pure panic. Years of lies began collapsing in front of everyone. The golden boy was gone. Only the truth remained. The verdict arrived days later. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom. Simple. Final. Powerful. After more than a decade of harm and manipulation, Caleb was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Just like that, it was over. Or at least that chapter was. The aftermath changed everything. The stone house on Briar Lane was eventually sold. My father withdrew from public life. The community that once worshipped Caleb suddenly pretended they had never supported him. Funny how quickly people rewrite history when the truth becomes unavoidable. A few months later, my mother sent me a letter. 3 pages. Every line filled with apologies, regret, sorrow. I read it carefully. Then I placed it in a drawer. Not because I hated her. Not because I wanted revenge. But because healing cannot be rushed. Some roads take longer than others. And that's okay. Sarah and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. Every Sunday we talked. Not about the past all the time. Sometimes about therapy. Sometimes about work. Sometimes about absolutely nothing. The important thing was that we were trying. And sometimes trying is enough. People still ask whether I regret making that first report. Whether I regret losing my family. Whether I regret 5 years of exile. My answer is always the same. No. Because truth isn't measured by how quickly it wins. Sometimes truth moves slowly. Sometimes it spends years buried beneath fear and denial. But eventually it rises. Eventually it finds light. And when it does, nothing can stop it. If you're watching this and you feel alone because you stood up for what was right, remember something. Being rejected for telling the truth does not make you wrong. Being outnumbered does not make you wrong. And standing alone does not mean you will stand alone forever. Sometimes you're not the ghost. Sometimes you're the lighthouse. The person showing others where safety exists. The person helping others find their courage. And you may never realize how many lives you're changing just by refusing to stay silent. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need this message today. And before you go, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep believing in the truth, and remember that even the darkest storms eventually lead to daylight.